So without further ado, we've still got some people filtering in, but I think I'll just introduce Cathie, and then I will also be on the chat and the Q&A in the background if anyone is stuck at all. So if anyone's not familiar with Cathie, she is a very experienced independent social worker. She regularly assesses children and adults with additional needs for SEND Tribunals, judicial review, the family court, and the Court of Protection. I've had the pleasure of working with Cathie personally, so I know you're going to get a lot out of her expertise this evening. She has got an MA in Autism. She is an approved mental health professional, and she has just completed her 3rd year of psychotherapy training with Contact Point in Bristol. Cathie is neurodivergent, which is autistic with ADHD, which adds a different dimension to her professional creativity. She is passionate about social work with a focus on sound, ethical practice, where she seeks to ensure a person's assessed needs are at the forefront of any decisions made. As part of a team of highly acclaimed experts, Cathie has recently co-written the draft social work practice guidance on fabricated or induced illness on behalf of the British Association of Social Workers, which will be published next year. So please rest assured, you're in expert hands, and without further ado, I'll hand you over to Cathie. Thank you, Cathie.
Thanks, Hayley, and thank you all for being here. So I am going to talk about fabricated or induced illness, and it's going to be a very abbreviated version because I could be here for hours, but I just wanted to give you some of the context as to why this has happened and why I've been involved in writing the practice guidance. And what it was as an independent social worker, I was having more and more inquiries and contacting parents who wanted me to do an assessment where they were accused of fabricated or induced illness. And even when parents hadn't said that in the initial contact, when I was going to assess their child and meet the family, parents were tentatively telling me and feeling quite ashamed about the fact that they'd been accused of FII. And so it was a growing theme emerging. And then when I linked up with other professionals, found out this was happening all over the UK and something needed to happen. And fortunately, I was involved with, and I still am involved with, the British Association of Social Workers in Wales, because I live in Wales. And I was able to bring it to one of the practice development meetings. And consequently, sort of things happened and we ended up being, well, I ended up being asked to write the practice guidance. And therefore, I sort of, with help from the PDA Society, connected up with other professionals who had a really keen interest and were working with families where FII was an issue. So that's why it's happened. That's the background. And I'm really sorry that we have to talk about FII because I wish it wasn't happening. It's massive. We don't quite know the statistics, but I know at the moment there is a poll looking across the UK to find out how many SEND parents have been accused of FII, because I think it's quite a large proportion. So that's the background. I'm just going to go into share screen. So what I'm going to talk about comes from the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health recently issued practice guidance, which was earlier in the year. And this is what they say about FII. So first of all, you look at where they look at perplexing presentations. It's particularly when a medical condition is not understood. So that could be something like chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, autism, ADHD, global developmental delay, lots of different things that can't necessarily be accurately tested. Could be a perplexing presentation. And it's an alerting sign to possible fabricated or induced illness. You can download their guidance and see what they have to say. It's very interesting. And so FII is described by the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health as a clinical situation in which a child is likely to be harmed due to parents' behaviour and action, which is carried out in order to convince doctors that the child's state of physical and or mental health and neurodevelopment is impaired or more impaired than it actually is. So that's their criteria. This is really important to notice as well. FII is not in itself, it's not a diagnosis, it's not any diagnostic manual. And it's more about professionals suspecting a parent is creating or exaggerating their child's difficulties with no identifiable evidence to substantiate this. And this can be things, and parents watching this will have children that are perceived as fine in school and they're not at home. And so even that kind of situation could underlie an accusation of FII happening. I'm really not trying to scare the living daylights out of people, but I'm trying to give you as much information as possible so that you understand what happens and why it happens, and hopefully have some useful information to take away in case it does happen. So there's also often a misassumption by professionals that FII is the same as factitious disorder imposed on another, FDIOA, which is an extremely rare psychiatric diagnosis, and it used to be more commonly known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. It is really, really rare. And a couple of weeks ago, I was doing another presentation on FII, and I went on to the NHS England website and looked at FII, I googled it, and it said FII is the new name for Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Well, I can tell you that categorically it is not the same. And that information was because I thought when I first heard about it, I did think they were the same condition. And Dr. Dania Glazer, who's very much part of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health Guidance, said to me, it's not a diagnosis, it's a set of presentations. So hold that in your mind. So it's considered a form of emotional and physical abuse and can lead to neglect. In genuine cases of FII, the caregiver will often truly believe their perception of their child's difficulties with no intention of deception. And at the other end of the spectrum, caregivers will deliberately induce symptoms in their child. That does happen. I haven't met parents that have done that. But what I do is meet parents who have a child with difficulties and know there's something not quite right and want to find out what is going on. The Royal College criteria are as follows. So in the child, it's reported physical, psychological or behavioural symptoms and signs which are not observed independently in their reported context. So that would be if a child were at home and they were presenting behaviours that the family were noticing and they weren't seen in school or any other environment, that would be one of the criteria for considering FII. And then unusual results of investigations, which can be biochemical findings or infections. I've not met that. I haven't known that happen in my time as a social worker. An inexplicably poor response to prescribed treatment. Now, I would say with that if you don't actually know what you're treating, then the medication prescribed or the treatment prescribed probably won't work. It sort of can be trial and error. And then some characteristics of the child's illness may be physiologically impossible, such as a negative fluid balance, large blood loss without a drop in hemoglobin. And I also know that there are some very rare conditions that aren't known, and it takes me back to thinking of a case many years ago in family court where a child was removed because they had a baby was removed because they had a green stick fracture on their leg, and actually it ended up that the child had a really, really rare condition, and so they're not always understood why things happen. And unexplained impairment of child's daily life, including school attendance, aids, socialisation. So if you have an autistic child who can't go to school, not because they don't want to, but they actually can't go to school, it's too much, and they're socially isolated, that would also be one of the criteria for FII. And then we think about the parents' behaviour. The parents' insistence on continued investigations instead of focusing on symptom alleviation when reported symptoms and signs not explained by any known medical condition in a child. Parents' insistence on continued investigations, focusing on symptom when results of examination and investigations have already not explained the reported signs or symptoms. So this is parents pushing for something to happen, would be seen as an indicator of FII. And then repeated reporting of new symptoms. Repeated presentations to and attendance of medical settings, including emergency departments. And that's quite alarming. That yes, if a parent were going to a different A&E every time to sort of avoid being detected that they were sort of creating difficulties, that would be a cause for concern. But if a parent is taking a child to an emergency department or for medical treatment because they are genuinely concerned about their child, that should not be an indicator of FII. That really needs to be an indicator something's going on from a medical point of view, and we don't know what's happening, and it needs to be investigated further. And then inappropriately seeking multiple medical opinions is frowned upon. Providing reports by doctors from abroad which are in conflict with UK medical practice. And that's an issue that has come up where there are sort of disputes between, this is my experience, it might not be other people's, between NHS professionals, medical professionals and private professionals. So there's sort of a hierarchy. But then if you bring into the equation a professional from abroad, that and they've assessed a child or young person, that is significantly frowned upon. But I was working with a parent whose child had a very, very rare condition, which wasn't in dispute. And they took their child to the USA for pioneering treatment, and it was life-saving. And yet that was, in the context of FII, that was frowned upon. And it wasn't the initial condition, which was actually very, very evident, that was criticised, but it was actually things that happened after that. And then a child repeatedly not brought to some appointments, often due and cancelling appointments. Some children don't want to keep going to appointments. Some children find just getting out of the house absolutely massive. And so they don't go, and it's really, really stressful for them. And so I don't think that a child not going to an appointment is necessarily constitutes or contributes to FII. Not able to accept reassurance or recommended management, and insistence on more clinically unwarranted investigations, referrals, continuation or new treatments, and sometimes based on internet searches. And I think this is a bit of, we can, all of us, maybe sort of have something that we feel we're not feeling very well, and we might check on the internet to find out what's going on and end up with all the symptoms. But I don't think it's about that. I think it's a really logical thing to do, to look on the internet, to find out things, to research. And I don't really think that necessitates a parent should be criticised. And an objection to communication between professionals is also frowned upon. And I'm not defending that, but sometimes parents have enough of communication between professionals happening when it's not helpful to them, when it's judging them, when it's not appropriate. And I know that when parents have done a subject access request, and this has happened many times, they've been really, really astounded at the information that's been communicated between professionals and the communication of inaccurate information. Frequent vexatious complaints about professionals are seen as FII. Now, my understanding of vexatious is something when it just keeps happening and it's not substantiated and it sort of escalates and escalates. And yet many of the parents who I've worked with who have been accused of FII, before the accusations were made, had made a complaint. And that might have been against the school, it might have been against the local authority, it might have been against health, it might have been against a doctor. And with schools, there are instances where the school will contact the local authority and say, I think this parent's got FII, and that sort of instigates a child protection investigation. Not letting the child be seen on their own. Some children will not cope with being seen on their own, and they need that parent there. And I'm thinking of children where most children have a very strong attachment to their parent, but if a child has difficulties, they are going to rely on that parent caregiver to be there to sort of keep them emotionally and physically safe. And then parents talking for the child, or the child repeatedly referring or deferring to the parent. So that takes me back to my son. Now he's in his 20s, but when he was very young, he was selective mute and he couldn't talk outside of the home. It took him a really long time to get there. And so we were talking for him because he couldn't do it. He would communicate with his eyes and his actions, but he was not able to speak for himself outside of the home because his anxiety was too high. Repeated or unexplained changes of school, and that's even switching to homeschooling, can be an indicator of FII, or changing GP or paediatrician or health team. Factual discrepancies in statements that the parents make to professionals or others about their child's illness. That might not be factual discrepancies, that might be professionals not listening properly to what's being said. There might be things that in one situation a child presents one way, in another situation they present a different way. So they might look like factual discrepancies. They're just lots of differences that can't necessarily be quantified or accounted for. And then parents pressing for irreversible or drastic treatment options where the clinical need for this is in doubt or based solely on parental reporting. Therefore, if we follow the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health guidance, the proposed assessment criterion for FII is likely to, and does, cast suspicion on many families who are not harming their children, including autistic children and young people where their presentations have been misunderstood and subsequently misdiagnosed. So some of the conditions that in the practice guidance we've written about are things like chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, hypermobility syndrome, autism, pathological demand avoidance, all those sorts of things that are, and the other one is pandas, which is when a sort of infection happens and it causes a flare-up and significant changes in behaviours. And there are disputes between professionals about whether or not it actually exists, and there are massive disputes about pathological demand avoidance or demand avoidant behaviour. So there aren't statistics at the moment for FII, only Munchausen syndrome by proxy or factitious disorder imposed on another. As I say, the statistics for that are very, very low. It is a really rare disorder, which needs a psychiatric diagnosis for it to be proved. And with FII, there doesn't have to be any psychiatric diagnosis. There's not a psychological assessment. When FII has gone to family court, that sometimes a parent is assessed by a psychologist who understands FII, but it gets to that place before any psychological assessment has happened. And my thinking is, why not do that much earlier before it gets to family court and causing so much distress to everybody? Literature on Munchausen syndrome by proxy suggests a prevalence ranging from 0.4 in 100,000 to 2.8 in 100,000, depending on the criteria that's used. And there are around 12,540,000 children under 16 in the UK, meaning there could be between 50 and 351 true cases of Munchausen syndrome by proxy in the UK. There could be, I doubt there are, but there are a heck of a lot more parents and families where they are accused of FII. I know that. So factitious disorder imposed on another does exist, but it's rare. It's a formal psychiatric diagnosis. It requires an intent to deceive. It's not about a parent being anxious about their child's welfare. It isn't, an intentional act. And care must be taken to balance desire to find true positive cases against the risk of high numbers of false positive cases and the damage that wrongful FII accusations bring to families. When families are accused of FII, one, they have a really significant, massive, and sometimes very, very expensive battle to sort of turn things around. But it also causes inordinate distress, trauma, I say chronic trauma, because it goes on a long time. It takes families a very, very long time to recover, and some never recover. And then FII asserts the belief that taking a child for multiple health investigations is inherently emotionally abusive, and that the reason why a parent does so, why they do it, is not relevant. So just taking a child for many assessments. So if you're thinking for SEND parents, a child where trying to get a young person, child or young person's EHCP, having speech and language therapy assessment, psychology, educational psychology assessment, maybe a psychiatric assessment, maybe an independent social work assessment, lots of different assessments that could tick the box for FII. And FII lacks clarity. It has no evidence base. It's poorly defined and actively includes anxious and concerned parents. It is not a diagnosis. And it's far more likely that a child has a complex condition that is difficult to identify or diagnose than the family is fabricating or inducing illness. So I'm going to talk through this case I worked with, where I've changed all the details to anonymise it, and so but I'm going to talk through this, and it's a family that I supported, and I just want to highlight how things happen in the SEND arena. So this is about Ella. She's an 8-year-old girl. She's diagnosed with as autistic, has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, pathological demand avoidance, learning disabilities, sensory processing differences, it's non-verbal, and sleep difficulties. Now, a lot of different diagnoses, and that's really common with lots of children and young people that I assess. I have lots of diagnoses that follow on from each other. So Ella lives with Sarah, her mother, who's a Black woman, and recently privately diagnosed as autistic herself with ADHD. There's a common theme here that actually quite a lot of the parents who are accused of FII, and I'm not saying by any means all of them, are autistic or have ADHD, they're neurodivergent, and it's not picked up. So attention to detail, challenging injustice, being very pedantic and clear about information that's shared, it's features, I know for myself, is often a feature of being autistic. And so I think a significant proportion are autistic. So the concerns for Ella are that she can't manage her personal care. She's incontinent and smears feces, very limited diet. She has to sleep with her mother. She won't go to sleep on her own. And that's something that I see with quite a few of the children and young people I work with. They need another parent or somebody with them at night. Ella has no concept of risk and must be constantly supervised. She has no peer connections, self-harming behaviours like banging her head, hitting herself, and breaking furniture at home. So having observed Ella, she's all over the place when I saw her. So Sarah requests an education, health and care plan, as Ella is often not managing to go to her mainstream school. So The school was good. It was all the support that was needed that the mother was challenging, support in school and support at home. The school recently reported, Ella is a solitary child, does not engage appropriately with her peers. There are numerous times when Ella displays difficult behaviours such as hitting, biting and throwing herself on the floor. So Ella is assessed by the CAMS, Consultant Child and Adolescent Psychiatrist. And they wrote, all social interaction has to be on her terms. Ella doesn't know how to stick to social boundaries and she is constantly sniffing, kissing, hugging and putting her hands on her mother's ears. That's all sensory stuff. Ella avoids social contact and when in social groups she withdraws and she fails to understand others' feelings. She has no concept of peer pressure and presents as if she is in her own world. So the report by the child and adolescent psychiatrist was actually a really good summary of Ella's needs. So Sarah requested an assessment from Children's Social Care. I don't want to put anyone off from asking for an assessment from Children's Social Care, but this might put you off. As well as being autistic with ADHD, Sarah has diagnosis of hypermobility syndrome and she experiences overwhelming fatigue. So, she's very, very tired, and added to that, she has a child who does not stop unless, apart from when they do sleep at night. So Ella is assessed as a child in need under Section 17 of the Children Act. However, when the assessment happens, Sarah doesn't get a copy of the assessment, so she had to pursue this. And then when she reads it, she's absolutely dismayed about what's written about her. So she said when the social worker would turn up to do the assessment, she'd have Ella with her. She was having to attend to her. And there was no way that she could privately talk about what was going on. So she just had to say it, because if she didn't say it, nothing was going to change. The social worker wrote this: Sarah presents as highly anxious on visits. She talks non-stop, repeating the same information, and she refuses to listen to any suggestions I make. When I challenged or disagreed with Sarah, she got increasingly angry, repeating that no one understands. Sarah was observed to be presenting high levels of anxiety during home visits, which is understandable. In her discussions with me, she said she was diagnosed with a borderline personality disorder in her teens. Due to her emotional presentation and her high anxiety, I am concerned that Sarah's mental health is impacting upon her ability to manage Ella's behaviours, and she is exaggerating her needs to elicit attention because of her own poor mental health. And what I would say here is that is a children and family social worker making an assessment of the mother's mental health without the training or expertise to do that. Consequently, Ella is placed on a child protection plan. And then the child protection plan minutes, which also took her a long time to get, read as follows. Sarah presents as if she is suffering from some trauma. She has high emotional needs, lots of anxious behaviours. Professionals are concerned that lack of emotional connection to Ella is causing her to react aggressively because she is not meeting her needs and she is too preoccupied with her own. Ella's difficulties are due to Sarah's inadequate parenting and her need to exaggerate her difficulties to elicit attention and to get help. I think that's a really harsh thing to write about any parent. Sarah's autism and ADHD diagnosis were disregarded with Children's Services, and they actually chose to adopt her former misdiagnosis of borderline personality disorder, which happens. So there are a significant proportion of autistic people, particularly autistic women, who are misdiagnosed with a personality disorder, and later it transpires that they are autistic. And this year I've been working with two young women who have both had a personality disorder diagnosis, have both been in hospital, and then it sort of later, a long time later, transpired that they are actually autistic. So it happens. And I also very, very aware of people sort of honing in on the personality disorder diagnosis, and despite very clear evidence that the person is not personality disordered, they choose to stick to that. The local authority refused to make any reasonable adjustments to support Sarah despite her numerous requests. So she wanted sort of clear notes. She wanted to be allowed to record meetings for her own feedback, not for anything else, and including and having somebody with her as well when assessments were happening to support her. They just didn't make any adjustments and completely dismissed them. So Sarah's accused of fabricated or induced illness. She's devastated. Her greatest fear is that Ella will be removed from her care. So what happened next? Sarah sought independent expert assessments, providing evidence of Ella's needs, and they were really, really good expert assessments that gave a very clear, thorough analysis of what Ella needs to help her. And she also engaged good legal representation. Sarah kept detailed records of all correspondence with children's social care and other professionals, such as emails, details of calls, dates and times, and she took copious notes during meetings and requested minutes of all meetings as well. And I'd say any parent in this situation, do the same. Keep really, really clear records of what happens. And she also used the subject access request under the General Data Protection Regulation to gain copies of records held by different agencies, including education, health and social care. And then Sarah attended a special educational needs and disability tribunal where independent experts and the local authority representatives gave evidence. So the appeal was upheld, and Ella's EHP was issued with the judge accurately summarising her needs. So it's a really, really good summary of what needed to happen. And also, the judge highlighted the local authority's failure to make reasonable adjustments to accommodate Sarah's needs as an autistic mother. That was really, really evident. Sarah gave evidence in the tribunal and talked about her experiences of what had happened. And it was a very, very powerful message to give. However, the local authority chose to disregard the outcome of the tribunal, citing Sarah's parenting as an ongoing concern. So as the EHCP parts of the education happened, so there was support for school, but the local authority just chose to stay with the child protection, and that Sarah has FII. So Ella remained on a child protection plan, and Sarah is awaiting a family court hearing. So this is the checklist that we have included in the practice guidance. Really, hopefully it will help social workers, because what the practice guidance is for is to inform their practice and to help them make better decisions. So these are some of the other questions that we came up with as a team that need to be asked, and it will just be a yes or a no. Does the child have an existing diagnosis? Is there reliable evidence to support their diagnosis? Could their presentation be attributed to an existing diagnosis, or is a further medical diagnostic assessment needed? Do parents or siblings have a diagnosed physical, neurological, psychological condition? Because we know that very often conditions run in families. Are there disputes between medical professionals about a child's diagnosis? Is there an interprofessional dispute about the existence of the child's reported condition, e.g. ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, PANS, PANDAS, PDA? Does the child present differently in school, college compared to at home? Has the parent made a complaint against the referring agency organisation? Has the parent previously made complaints against a local authority? Is the parent seeking a child to have an education, health and care plan, or are they appealing an existing one? if the parents of the child are separated, is there a disagreement about the child's presentation and diagnosis? And say this because it happens when parents separate, that one parent might believe, for example, their child's autistic, want them to be assessed, and then the one in the relationship who's left might not agree, and then accusations of FII can happen from the partner who's left the relationship because they don't agree with what's happening. So for families where there have been concerns about FII, the interactions between them and children's social care have often compounded their sense of feeling victimised and disempowered. And one of the things is, and I just found this really, really perplexing and unfortunate, is when parents are, they're accused of FII, they went to social care wanting support, but they don't get the services put in place to support them. So while this is all going on, and they were probably in a really, really sort of stressful, difficult situation when they actually went to social care, it gets worse because they are accused of FII. There is a risk that their children can be removed, and children are removed when parents are accused of FII, and I've seen that happen as well. And they're just not having the support and have nobody to turn to. That's really, really hard. Many parents accused of FII report their experiences of engaging with social care as undignified and traumatic. Whereas the social worker has sought to protect and promote the well-being of the child or young person, there have been cases where the focus has been on a parent's historical mental health issues and a lack of parental boundaries rather than considering the bigger picture. And so I think this could be a whole nother presentation, but social workers tend to focus on a neurotypical approach of parenting or a one approach, and don't allow for different parenting approaches. And so then it means that people such as myself, who are neurodivergent, I parent in a different way, and that's criticised. And I've just said that they dismiss alternative parenting styles. So what needs to change? Fundamentally, safeguarding the welfare of children is essential. However, a clear understanding of a child's needs must be established. Professionals must understand FII is not the same as Munchausen syndrome by proxy or factitious disorder imposed on another. Training on neurodivergence is needed to prevent children and their parents from being marginalised, excluded, feeling victimised, rather than their differences being celebrated. And different approaches to parenting must be understood with less emphasis on a neurotypical style being the only way. And I'm actually running a training day next week with a woman called Esther, who's a mother she's autistic, and she went through the family court because her child was taken from her care, not in relation to FII, and her child is back with her. But she said that the parenting bar for her was much higher than is expected for most parents. She felt the standard was set unbelievably high, and there was no way that she could keep achieving it. And I'm going to stop sharing, so we're on to questions. So hopefully we've got lots of time to answer questions.
Thank you so much for that, Cathie. That was really, really helpful. We have got some questions coming in, and as ever, normally as you start going through the questions, you get more and more questions coming in. So we'll try and get through as many as possible. Starting we've got one here from a lady called Marie. She says, we've been accused of FII, child now diagnosed with PDA. How can I go about removing alerts and amending the accusations? I have a PHSO complaint, read this, but waiting for an investigator. I'm very upset to read that a head teacher has accused me of emotional abuse following a stage 3 meeting. There is no evidence of trails of notes to evidence this.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if there's inaccurate information, that does need to be removed. from records, and I think there are processes to achieve that. However, this is the tragedy of this, is when parents are accused of FII and their name is cleared, it stays on their records. And so I've worked with parents, and I am working with parents where they are still highly anxious when they go for a medical appointment, or even A&E or anything, because it will still be on their records and they still feel like they're being treated differently because of it, even though they are, 100% cleared and they do not have FII, which is not really a condition anyway. So that's something that needs to change. I haven't got the power to change it. I don't know how that gets changed, but it absolutely does need to happen, because I think it's incredibly discriminatory and morally wrong that happens. So I haven't got an answer to that question. Something needs to happen, something needs to change. It's probably somebody needs to lobby Parliament or something.
Thank you very much, Cathie. I think we've got lots of parents in the room with us this evening who are obviously going through the same thing. Summarising this question, because it's quite a long one, but a parent is saying here, what we do if fabricated illness is cited rather than take a child with complex needs into their school. So her question is about the fact that she was asked to provide as much detail as possible for a child going into a potential setting, and provided all of that information. The child was enrolled by county, and then the day that they were due to start, the head called in the parents into the office and said that they couldn't come into the school, and next thing that they know, that they had reported them for FI. And they were saying it was eventually completely squashed and ripped apart, but their whole lives were discussed in a panel meeting, and they felt very, very traumatized. So lots of parents seem to be echoing the sentiments obviously you've already touched upon in your presentation this evening.
Yeah, I mean, I just find it really disheartening to hear that so many families are going through this. It's unnecessary, and I'm not saying that no parent fabricates things, because there probably are a very few that do it, but most of the parents that I've worked with genuinely, and probably parents you work with, Hayley, genuinely want the right support for their child. And I just think, the other thing I am aware of as well is that nationally there has been training on FII, which takes a very medical model rather than a social model. So it's the Royal College guidelines for FII, and then people are hearing about it, and then so schools, social care, and then it's being reported. So a head or Senko in the school, somebody will ring up local authority, and that sets the ball rolling for massive investigations. And there was one instance where two parents in the same school were independently reported for FII. So it's just really concerning, the power that it has when somebody makes that allegation.
I agree, Cathie. It's very, very, very worrying from what we're seeing on the chat this evening. Next question, as I expected, as we started going through the questions, there's more and more coming in, so just bear with me. There's going straight up. That's just a comment. So in practical terms, somebody's asked here, what can parents do when they are accused of FII? Have you got any practical advice for them?
Yeah, it isn't necessarily going to go away straight away. So I think it's about, I know this is hard, but it's keeping a cool, measured head, working, engaging with social care. Do not shut your front door and say they can't come in. I tell parents, I say, look, I know this is really difficult to hear, but you have to work with social care. They've got the power, and they will have the power if they go to family court. So you've got to work with them, and I think it is about keeping accurate records of things that happen. So if you're making a phone call, make a note of it in your diary, the time you phoned, who you spoke to, what date it was, that sort of thing. Keep meticulous details, keep hold of emails. If you're saying something verbally, back it up in emails, leave an evidence trace of what's happened. Use GDPR to, subject access requests to get information. Do that for medical records, health, and education and social care. And get them. And if they're highly, highly redacted, then complain about that as well, because that shouldn't be happening. So I think the most important thing, as traumatic as it is to try and keep a really measured approach. And you know, I think we all like to believe that justice happens in the end, but it doesn't always happen in the end. But you have to sort of keep trying to sort of systematically get through it. And I also think the other thing, this is hard, but is actually trying to implement good self-care when you're going through the process. So don't hit bottles of wine and stuff to cope, actually do something productive just to sort of try and keep well, because it's a really, really awful experience to go through.
I just wanted to also touch a note on there, Cathie, in relation to the Dpa requests. If anyone's unfamiliar with how they work, you can request from your local authority any data in relation to your child. So anything that references your child is required to be disclosed for you. And if you ask for education, health and care records, you get that to a central department. If you just go on your local authority's website or type in Data Protection Act request and your local authority's name, there'll be a specific place where you can make that request to and actually ask for those documents. They have to provide them to you. It's a legal duty. So there is ways to access the information. If the information that you get from the Data Protection Act is incorrect, you can then challenge that and get the record straight in those minutes. So keep your own minutes. Cathie documented that very well in her presentation, and then also you can challenge anything you get through the Data Protection Act. Another question here, Cathie, in relation to social workers. Can social workers make and circulate inaccurate medical diagnoses as their own professional opinion? Is this within their remit?
Oh.
I'm glad you said that.
No, I tell you what, if I did that in a tribunal or court, I'd be absolutely, you know, I'd be completely discredited. No, we cannot. Now, you know, I'm a mental health social worker, and I have worked with people where I've questioned the diagnoses with a psychiatrist. So, for example, you know, somebody comes into the mental health team with obsessive compulsive disorder. I'm thinking, no, they're autistic. And so, you know, I've suggested that to the psychiatrist, but I can't say, actually, the psychiatrist is wrong and I'm absolutely right, because they are the diagnosticians, I'm not. So we can question, but we can't diagnose.
There's another question here from a lady called Anna. She says, how do I find out if I have been accused of FII? Since my ex-husband, who claims our son is fine, has been in touch with the GP and school, son's not been in school since September due to anxiety. All attitudes towards me have changed and now lack of support. And GP argued with me about obvious signs of anxiety, having seen my son, makes the fight for help even harder. Obviously, that may be one where the parent wants to make obviously a GDPR request, certainly, to see any paperwork. But I don't know if you've got any additional tips there. I
don't. I mean, there shouldn't be. Now, I know I was working with somebody last year. There was a whole year before a social worker and a police officer turned up on their doorstep to remove their child where they were suspecting FII. And, you know, unless, so things do happen behind closed doors, but really the Working Together to Safeguard Children 2018 document, which again, you can download on the internet, and it's a really, really useful, very easy to read document. It says about openness and transparency with parents, unless there is an immediate risk to the child. Now, in this case, last year, if there's an immediate risk to the child, why did they take a year to go and remove the child? That's my question. Thankfully, that one was sorted. So.
Another one here in relation to social workers, Cathie, it's a lady called Rachel. She said, can we actually find out social workers' qualifications?
You can, if you go on to Social Work England or Social Care Wales, or I don't know what the equivalent is in Scotland, you can look at their whether they're registered. They should have qualifications, but you don't necessarily know what their training is, what their background is. I know parents have questioned social workers about if they've got autism training and stuff, and they've got a very defensive reaction. It shouldn't happen. We should be honest about what training we've done and what we haven't, and whether something is within our sort of professional expertise or not. That's what I think. But some social workers are very cagey about it.
I think we can both agree with that. Obviously, being in the presence of a social worker, you will most likely agree, Cathie. Obviously, I work in the SEND Tribunal and of course Court of Protection, so we very much see a range of different social workers, some who are very good like yourself, and some that obviously do unfortunately make parents' lives very difficult. And somebody's also said in the Q&A section, they've completely put off asking for a social care assessment in the social care sections of an EHC plan because they've been accused of FII. And I assume that you're seeing that more and more, where parents actually aren't accessing support because they're so worried of what's going to happen outside. Is that something you're seeing a lot of?
Yeah, and yeah, they just, I mean, parents just want social care out of the equation, or think that they can get me to do, you know, I can do an assessment and they don't have to have the contact with social care, but it doesn't work like that. And so because they're so fearful about what could happen.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if you can provide some advice. This is from an anonymous attendee. They say, I'm a foster carer of 3 siblings. They made a complaint about a new social worker and he retaliated by writing a fictitious report for court and stated I have FII. I am applying for an SGO, but not only is he opposing it, he is seeking a court order to remove the children. She says, I can't afford a solicitor, but if there's any advice or signposting, that would be greatly appreciated.
I don't know what to say to that one, because I think
that's riddled with concerns, isn't it?
Yeah. And I you know, if I don't know, I mean, is that going to go to family court or will it not? Or you know, that's a question, because if it does, would there not be legal aid agency funding? You know, so there's a whole lot of things there I'm not sure about. Again, though, what I've said, and I know this is sort of labouring the point, it is about keeping accurate records. It's backing everything up with evidence, you know, asking you know, GPs or anybody that knows you well to sort of support you, and it's sad that it has to be like that, but you do need to do it. It needs to be a very systematic approach to try and achieve the best possible outcome.
Yeah. A lady called Marie has also said, CAMHS has recently downplayed the seriousness of FII as if it's part and parcel of life for many people. How can I respond, as I feel like I am suffering with PTSD when it's even brought up? It's just so traumatic, even going to the GP. And obviously lots of parents are finding themselves in this vicious circle, really, that they can't get out of. I don't know if you've got any tips for anyone going through this in terms of people downplaying the seriousness of FII. Obviously, you've done lots of research into it.
Yeah, I think if there's a lot online about FII. There's so I think and the practice guidance with BASWA is coming out next year, so it's not that far away. So I think that's hopefully going to be a very powerful, useful document. So I think it is about, and this is really difficult to be heard, isn't it? To actually say, this is how it's affected me. This is how traumatized I am by this, because your whole sort of who you are is questioned. It's like you're making up something for your own gain. It's a really, really awful allegation. I know that families that I've worked with, I'm not saying all families, because not all families can do this, but I've actually had to pay privately to get the right therapeutic support to try and work through the trauma that they've experienced because of this.
Lots of people in the Q&A section also, Cathie, are asking obviously about your details. What we'll make sure that we do is when we pop this up, we'll obviously put your details across onto that document, as long as it's obviously okay with you, so people know who you are and where to find you, because there's lots of obviously questions around that. And just to remind everybody, if this is the first time you've logged in, all of our webinars are recorded and they all go up onto our YouTube and on our website as well, www.senlegal.co.uk. So if you are scribbling as you were watching Cathie's webinar this evening, please do go back and rewatch it. And similarly, there's lots of people in the same boat, so please do share it with other families that you think it might be helpful to, because it's such a unique opportunity to get somebody of Cathie's calibre completely free of charge out to parents. So we really want to make sure we do share this webinar. I think we've got time for just maybe one or two,
Okay.
Cathie, because I'm aware that it's quite demanding, asking lots of questions back to back. So one of the questions here is, do social workers receive training if they have been found to write reports on opinion and not facts?
Well, that's what should happen. I don't know. I think social work, I qualified in 1993. It's a very long time ago. I think social work as training has changed. That's my impression. But we should be writing any assessment and report on fact, not what we think and not on supposition. But it happens all the time, just as I read, from the case the earlier case of Sarah. That is what was said about her, and that's based upon social work opinion, and that went to tribunal on social work opinion. Okay.
Cathie, we've got questions coming in quicker than we can answer them. So unfortunately, we're not going to get to them all this evening. But I just wondered if there's perhaps kind of a lasting thought you might want to leave with, obviously, the listeners tonight. Lots of parents seem to be in the same position. Lots of the questions coming through about them personally going through the experience of being accused of FII. So I wondered if you just wanted to kind of leave a lasting note before we log off this evening.
Yeah, I think what I want to say is there's hope, and it might not feel like it at the moment, but there is hope. There is a heck of a lot happening in sort of the area of FII. So not only is the practice guidance coming out next year, but actually local authorities are starting to want social work training on FII. I did one last week or the week before last. So and there's a whole lot of other things happening where FII is going to be really, really publicised, like a Channel 4 documentary, and BASWA are really, really on board with this. So there's a lot happening, and I think next year's going to be a really big year to get FII on the agenda. It's a bit like many years ago, people didn't really, including me, didn't really know a lot about autism. And now we see autism everywhere. It's sort of on television, it's on social media. The awareness has been really enhanced. And I hope with FII that there's a much better awareness and understanding, particularly that it is not a diagnosis. So
it's not
a psychiatric disorder. Okay.
Thank you, Cathie. I really appreciate your time this evening. I can see from how many people have been engaging with us on the chat, it's been really, really helpful. Just a reminder to parents to share the webinar if you think it's been helpful. Obviously, pass it on to colleagues and friends, and hopefully the more of us that talk about FII and get the knowledge out there, we can stop this happening and families going through this traumatic experience. Thank you very much for your time this evening, Cathie. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Hayley, and thank you, everybody. Thank you.